Let's take our Bibles. Let's turn to our study in the book of Hebrews, where we are. If you're visiting, each week studying verse by verse through the book of Hebrews, and we are in Hebrews chapter 11. If you are visiting with us and you haven't found it, in your bulletin is a sermon notes page for you. It'll help you follow along and be able to really track with what we are saying, what we're learning from our passage in Hebrews. And if you're the kind of person that doesn't like taking notes and an outline because you seem too restricted and confined to that, don't worry about that. Just grab you a piece of paper, write down something, or just in your own mind, just you and the Lord commune and fellowship around His Word as you listen to it being taught and proclaimed. So here in the book of Hebrews, we are looking at a book that really is reminding us of this great theme of how much Jesus is better. And I really hope, brothers and sisters, that all through life, God keeps giving you these moments, these situations in your life to where you really come to the conclusion again and again that Jesus is better. For 6 chapters here, the writer has been telling us what kind of person Jesus is and why He is better. I mean, isn't He really better than the job you have, right? How about better than the job you hope you have? Yeah, He's better than that. And He is really better, isn't He, than any stage of life. And I've been thinking through this a little bit just in reviewing in my mind this morning that any stage you can find yourself in, He is far better than that. He's better than the stage of singleness or married life. Whether you have kids or you're without kids, whether you have grandchildren or no grandchildren, whether you're young or old, have plenty of money, just getting by, enjoy vacations, or you never get to go on a vacation, whatever life is for you, you should be, as a believer, to say, like the writer in Hebrews, that Jesus is a better person. There's nobody like Him. There is nothing like Him. And so for 6 chapters, He's unpacked that for us. Then in the second section, He's told us how Jesus is a better priest. He's the one that brings us to God, and we'll be reminded of that again, won't we, in communion? As 1 Peter 3:18 says, Christ is the one who died for the unjust. He was the just, the perfect one. He died for the unjust, that He might bring us to God. And so for chapters 7 to 10, the writer wants us to see how Jesus is a better priest. There's no one like Him who has brought us to God and reconciled us. And then the last section where we are in now, chapters 11 to 13, he talks to us about this principle of faith. And this is the last section of the book of Hebrews. And so to help us understand what faith is like in chapter 11, he describes it for us in the first 3 verses. It's kind of just here's what it looks like. Here's what it is. And so he's just describing it. And often definitions don't really help us, or descriptions don't help us. So beginning in verse 4, going all the way down to verse 40 in this chapter, he begins to put on display these Old Testament saints. Men and women who, when you look at their lives, say, that's what it means to really live for God and trust Him and live by faith. It's like the writer of Hebrews now for these 10 chapters has brought them to a place, and he says, hey, listen, I know you're a Christian. I know you're a believer. I know that you truly love Christ and you want to follow God. Let me show you now in this last section what that really looks like. And he reminds them by the first example of Abel that when you come to God, you enter a relationship of worship with Him. You come through a sacrifice, just like Abel did. His brother Cain wasn't coming through a sacrifice. He thought he could do something to get reconciled to God. But here we learned in verse 4 how Abel is an example of what it means to offer a better sacrifice, the sacrifice of God. And that reconciles us to God. But then when you come to God, we moved on in the passage of Hebrews 11, seeing in verses 5 through 6 how Enoch is an example of what it means to walk with God. Enoch walked with God and he pursued Him. So you come to God, you're reconciled to God, and now every day of life, you, if you're a believer, are seeking to walk by faith and walk beside Him and with Him through His Word. As we moved on to Noah, we were reminded of the story of the ark, and we were reminded in that one verse, this magnificent story of Noah building an ark and what it looks like to really work and serve God by faith. We're not just called to know God like Abel, and we're not just called to walk beside God. It should affect our life and the way we live and what we do and what we accomplish for His glory and His purposes. And so Noah taught us that. And then last week is where we dug into this section we're in right now. And it's the story of Abraham, verses 8 through 19. And this is a section really where now we get the most of anybody's story in the Hebrews 11 about the life of faith. And the reason for that, as we learned last week, is that Abraham is called the father of all those who believe. Doesn't mean he's the first person who ever believed God, because we know that Abel did, then Enoch did, and Noah did. But it means that he's the first as far as this magnificent example of what it really means to surrender your life, to really wholeheartedly follow God in the way that he has called you to follow him. And so he becomes, as it were, the most worthy example in this chapter, verses 8 through 19. Now, let me just remind you, it's in your notes there, that when we came to this story, we often thought about how that Abraham's life is the story of the sacrifice of his son, when he offered up Isaac, and it is, right? But that part of the story in Hebrews 11 doesn't come up until the very end of this story. In fact, I would tell you this, and you should know this obviously as a Christian, those magnanimous, magnificent sacrifices of the dearest thing to you probably don't happen unless some other things are in front of that in your life of faith, just like Abraham. And so we've seen that in this chapter that we're looking at and in these verses about Abraham, there are 5 things that I said we're going to learn about Abraham's faith as an example that you want to look at your life and say, is that the way I live? Does my life look like the faith of Abraham? I've come like Enoch. I've walked like Abel. I'm walking with God like Enoch. I'm working and serving the Lord like Noah. But now like Abraham, let's look at my life as an example and see if it's like that. So last week we learned that in that, and it's in your notes there, that Abraham begins in verse 8 on a pilgrimage. God called him, it says in verse 8, and he went out obeying God, not knowing where he was going. He went and he followed God, and that's how the life of faith begins. It's a pilgrimage. You're going to trust God. You don't have to always know where God's leading you, what he's doing, how he's going to provide. None of those things have to be clearly laid out in your mind. That's what the Bible calls walking by sight. But the scripture is really clear. We, God's people, we don't walk by sight. We don't live our life just based on what we can see and what we can touch and what always we've got figured out. We walk by faith. And so we saw that the life of faith begins with a pilgrimage, and then verses 9 and 10, we saw how Abraham was patiently enduring, verses 9 through 10. And just remember here that as we saw in those verses, Abraham in this world, it says in verse 9, lived in a tent, right? He leaves Ur of the Chaldees, that place that really could be described if you were looking for a piece of real estate and you got the real estate magazine of Ur of the Chaldees, it would read something just like this: lakefront property, 3-story homes, good schools, plenty of jobs available in the town. Social life beyond imagination. And he leaves all that, and he goes because God calls him to follow him, and he leaves his life in this world to begin to live in a tent. I mean, it'd be kind of like this. Let's just say God told us that he was going to give all of us the land of Scotland, right? He's not telling you that. This is not a word from God. I'm just using this as an example. He says, all right, I want you to leave America. I want you to go live in the land of Scotland. And by the way, I want you to live in a camper till your days are over. That's what I want you to do. Well, some of you be going, dang, that'd be great. There's something wrong with you, I think, if that's the case. So he lives in tents, verse 9 says, so that in verse 10, he might look for a city. He wasn't looking for anything in this world. He was looking for something out of this world, something beyond this world, and he calls it a city. And that's what caused him to patiently endure life in this world. You might just want to jot down or at least think about it and remember and go back and look at it at some point, though we didn't last week, what Paul wrote to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 16 through 18. Paul says, therefore, we do not lose heart. We don't give in. We don't feel like we're done and we can't make it in this life. Therefore, we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being, you know what it says there? Renewed day by day. Well, Paul, what is it that in this life renews you, makes you ready to go every day? Well, verse 17, he says, for momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. While here on the earth, he says, we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. That is the only thing that will make you endure patiently, not lose heart, not want to give up, no matter what life circumstance you find yourself in. And that's the kind of faith that Abraham had. He said, okay, God, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to begin this pilgrimage. You lead the way. You direct me in this world. I'm not going to settle down in this world. I'm not going to be really happy in this world. Ultimately, what I'm looking for is that city that's coming. That new Jerusalem, that heavenly kingdom of yours coming down. And we're going to talk more about that in just a moment as we get into the rest of these verses. But that is the thing that causes him to live as he did. So let's jump right in to verse 11. And let's look at the third point here. And it has to do with the power of Abraham's faith. Now, you know, as you read with me here, verses 11, 12, this is an amazing miracle that's recorded. Now, just in a few verses, all that's recorded in Genesis 12 to 21 is condensed here in these few verses in verse 11. Notice what he says. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him, this is God, faithful who had promised. Therefore, there was born even of one man, Abraham, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. So let me just kind of give you a few bullet points to take all that information that's condensed in these verses from Genesis 12 to 21 and remind you of the story. Now, in Hebrews 11, Abraham is called Abraham, but you know that wasn't his name originally, right? His name originally was Abram. And Abraham means exalted father or father of many. So back in his day, if you were to meet him and they'd say, hey, what's your name? You'd say Abraham. And that could be put in our vernacular as if to say today, oh, you're a proud papa. How many kids you got? 0. What do you mean? You call yourself proud papa and you ain't got any kids? Well, God's going to give me that. I love the way Donald Gray Barnhouse wrote about this. He said, Abram was always having to explain that he wasn't quite living up to his name. The question would come up from merchants and guests, who are you? How old are you? And how long have you lived here? What's your name? Abram. Oh, congratulations. You must be the proud father of many sons. How many sons do you have? None. Abram must have steeled himself, Donald Barnhouse says, from the half-concealed snort or sarcastic humor about the absurdity of his name. So he's called father here, and yet what's going to make it even more difficult and put him in a position to where he really is going to have to trust God is he goes from being called Abraham, and 13 years later God changes his name to Abraham, from Abram to Abraham 13 years later. So now guess what? He's not only going to be called Abram, but he's going to be called Abraham, a father of a multitude. This is like God putting him in a position to where God is going to get to display that only God can do what God says he will do. Now watch this. So that title sets him up for what we might call now the test. So in their minds, now that God waits all this time to fulfill this promise, they are in a place, humanly speaking, where it is impossible for them to have this promised child. And that's why in verse 11, as we read there, it says that about Sarah, she received the ability to conceive even beyond the proper time of life. It's just humanly impossible. And in verse 12, it says about Abraham that he didn't have the ability to father a child because he was good as dead. So God has put them both in a place of human impossibility, and this is to test their faith to the limit. Remember, again, this is 13 years later, and Abraham is naturally not able to produce this child. Now, let's put a little note here in this time of the test here, because this is really, in the Old Testament account and the narrative, a lapse in their faith. It's kind of like you and me at times where we say, now, God, I've been waiting on you to answer that prayer. I've been waiting on you to do that thing that I'm trusting you to do. And you're really taking just a little too long here, so maybe I need to do something to help this out. They've waited 13 years. We usually don't wait that long before we jump in and try to take over and do something. Waited 13 years, and in that process, while they're waiting, they go, Sarah and Abraham, and conceive of this plan that they're going to produce a child of their own. Maybe that'll be the promised one. And you know the story. That did not turn out well, right? Ishmael becomes the product of that which has become the father of the Arab nations. And that war which began has continued and will continue as a result of trying to do what you think you can do, Abraham and Sarah, to accomplish only what God can accomplish. It's one of those reminders again here that really God does put us in tests, but it's not a test so you can step in and do something. It's a test so you can learn to say, I'm still going to wait on him to do what only he can do. So that's what brings us to Hebrews 11, because in Hebrews 11, it says that by faith, they considered him faithful who had promised. You said, oh, wait a minute. You just told me about them messing up. Oh, they messed up in a lot of ways in the Old Testament narrative. Think about Sarah. Remember, she's the one that came up with the plan to go get Hagar, right? And I almost have an idea that in my mind that there might have been a moment whenever Abram said to her, hey, God called us to leave Ur of the Chaldees, and he's called us to pack our bags, mount a camel, and I don't know where we're going, but honey, let's go. That she might have said something about that. I can't imagine any woman that wouldn't, right? She might have said to Abraham, we left our beautiful home on the river for a camper in the wilderness. What are you talking about? What is this about? And Abram was less than a good husband as well on many occasions. Like, I'm sure, ladies, none of you are going to come up at the end of the service and say things like Sarah could have said about her husband. And I'm sure there's some things about your husband that you see are shortcomings in your mind. But I bet you're never going to come up to me and say, you know, my husband tried to give me away to two men while we were traveling on this journey that God called us to. That's what he did. Hey, tell them that you're my sister, because if they know you're my wife, they're going to kill me. And the kings almost had relationships with her because Abraham is trying to look out for his own hide. But what happens in Hebrews 11 can be confusing to people because they'll say, wait a minute, they weren't trusting God at times, and that's exactly right. But can I remind you of an important thing about God's assessment of people and our assessment of people? God sees what he's after, and God sees the product that he's producing, not always the failures along the way. Does he know them? Yes, he does. It's recorded in the scriptures. But God has a different conclusion about the lives of people than often we do. I bet you this morning, if I ask you, tell me what comes to your mind when you think of King David. Who comes to your mind? Absolutely. That's all we think of, right? King David. He's that guy who messed up, had this relationship with Bathsheba, went and had her husband killed, tried to cover it up until the prophet came and exposed him. But you ought to read in 1 Kings the conclusion of what God says about David. He says, David did all things right in the eyes of the Lord except with Bathsheba. That's a kind of different conclusion that maybe God comes to about people than we do. And so here, in this miraculous thing, God has called him to leave on this pilgrimage. He's called him to keep his eyes on that kingdom that is coming, that city that's coming, that he's going to ultimately live in with all of God's people. But along the way, God is going to cultivate his faith, grow his faith, puts him in the midst of a test so that he'll learn to not walk by sight, but by faith. And not try to think that God needs his help to accomplish something that only God says he can do. It'd be very similar, wouldn't it, to you trying to think, well, I can get somebody to come to Christ if I just say the right word, if I just do the right thing, if I just do this or that. It's really something that I can make happen. The reality is you can't save anybody. I can't save anybody. I have to be faithful to live it, faithful to present it, but in the end, only God can save sinners. That's what Jonah learned, right? Salvation is of the Lord. He's the one that saves people. So that's an idea here of really what I'm talking about. So let's go to the purposes in your life, and let's learn something really, really important here. I think this is the first application I want to drive home to you from these verses about Abraham's faith here and what it meant for him to have this faith that really did powerful things in his life. God's promises to believers are always, you want to underline this, always received by faith. Always received by faith. Now, that is important in so many ways. And I want you just to listen. If you don't get anything else right now, what we have said in the past, think about the application point that we're saying here. What God was going to miraculously do in the life of Abraham and Sarah was the result of him believing. Think of it this way. Jesus said in Matthew 19:26, right? With God, all things are, you know what that word is there? What does it say, church? Possible. So there's no impossibilities with God, right? With God, all things are possible. 19:26 of Matthew. Mark 9:23 puts it this way. All things are possible to him that believes. So the same context, same concept, but a different emphasis. On the one side, all things are possible to God. There's nothing he cannot do. Then on Mark 9:23, he says all things are possible to him that believes. So think of it like this. On the one side is God's power and his will, which is able to do anything. On the other side is our faith and our submission to God's will and God's purposes. And when those two connect, nothing is impossible. That's a very important truth to glean from what we're learning here about Abraham's faith and the powerful things that it accomplished in his life. Now, having said that, because we live in such a day of name it, claim it, if you want it, just pray and trust God for it. Make it up. Tell God he's going to do it. Get enough people to kind of force God by faith to do something. I need to make a statement to help you really understand what I'm talking about when I say what God wills, what God purposes, and what you believe when they come together bring impossible things to happen. I need to make a statement to help you understand something. And it's like this. Our faith must be in the stated promises of God in Scripture and not in the ones we have created. Now let that sink in. Our faith must be in the stated promises of God in Scripture and not in the ones we have created. Here's what I mean by created promises. And here's what's interesting about this. The creative promises we come up with are all sprinkled, wrongly so, with a bunch of Bible verses. Promises that we often create like this. God is always going to heal me. God is always going to heal the person that I'm praying for. If I just have enough faith, God will do it. Or, God is always going to give me lots of money. Or, I'm never going to suffer the loss of some young one or a young person in my life. That's just not, if I just trust God, they'll make it. They'll get through it. They'll come out of it. You know what's really interesting? When we think about death in older people, we often just as Christians say, well, that's just the end of the natural process. And we somehow are okay with that. But when we think about little ones, loved ones, sometimes children, we get all messed up somewhere in our mind. And say, but I was trusting God. This doesn't seem right. He didn't do this. He didn't let that little one live. Now, let me say this in all fairness. It is wonderful when God brings some of those little ones and some of those lives in jeopardy through. That's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing when you need God to provide for you and he graciously lavishes financially upon you. That's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing when someone's sick or you're sick and you pray and God heals you. Listen, I know he does that. I'm not telling you he doesn't. But I'm telling you, if you begin to think that the life of faith is you can come up and create any promise you want, you are going to have a very discouraged pilgrimage in this world. Let me give you a true story from Pam and I's life when we were young in ministry. A young couple who wrongly took covenant promises of a baptized child. They believed, and they were taught, and I believe wrongly so, that because their child was baptized and was a child in a covenant family, that child would come to faith in Christ one day. Well, as time rolled on and those kids became teenagers and they grew older, they completely rejected the gospel, completely walked away from everything they had been taught. Not just one of their kids, all those kids. Let me tell you what happened to that mom and dad because they created a promise that they were trusting God that he would do and he would keep. The mom and dad walked away from God and the gospel and the church. That's what happens, brothers and sisters. I want you to understand all of God's promises to believers are always received by faith, but they are the ones God states, not the one you and I create and sprinkle some verses over them. Very, very important point. So what are some of those promises? Let me just throw a few on the screen that you don't have to create. They are stated. And you and I should live in them and anchor our faith in him and believe that whenever this God who says he will and he can do the most miraculous things in our life, we join our faith to this and what seems impossible happens. Well, Philippians 1:6 is one of them, right? And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. That is an incredible stated promise of God. I don't know about you. I get up at times and I just wonder where my heart and my affections are and if I'm going to really keep pushing on and enduring. I know that that's what God calls me to, but I am comforted and I am putting my hope and my promise and anchoring it to a faith that I know that there is a God who is powerfully promising that what he began when I came to him in Christ, it's not going to stop. He's going to keep on doing that until this final day, which Abraham is looking for and we're looking for. What about Philippians 4:19? My God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. Great, great promise. He will do that. Romans 8:32. He who did not spare his own son but gave him up for us, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? There is nothing in your earthly temporal journey and life that you are here that if you have need of, he will not give to us. And listen to this. You want to put the right twist on that verse? He'll give it to you if it serves the purpose to make you more like Christ. Not just because he wants to dole out stuff to you. And he can be the glorified Walmart God, right? He is doing whatever he provides for you. He didn't spare his son. That rescued you, made you his. He's working in you. He'll continue that purpose until Christ returns. And you can count on it because he didn't spare his son. He'll give you whatever you need to make you more like his son. And it could be sometimes a financial thing. It could be sometimes a material thing. It could be. Does all those things to make us more like Christ. What about this one in Isaiah? Because I don't want you to think I just believe the promises are in the New Testament. They're there in the Old as well. Isaiah 40:29-31. This is God gives power to the faint, to him who has no might. He increases strength. Even youth shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. I mean, the best of the best will wear out. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Isaiah wants to give us another one in chapter 41, verse 10. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God, and I will strengthen you, and I will help you, and I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. What an amazing promise. So, when you come to the promises of God, when like Abraham, you are going to trust God and you want to see God work powerful, you'll only see him work powerfully in your life when your faith is anchored to the promises he has stated and not the ones you make up and you create. Very, very important. All right, that leads us to the next point. And that's in verses 13-16. Let me read them for you. All these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, and he has prepared a city for them. Now, we've already looked at this kind of in detail last week as we studied verses 9 and 10. So let me just kind of point out what these verses are saying. 3 quick points here about Abraham's faith and how he was persuaded that God was going to do this. Remember, Abraham begins on a pilgrimage. Abraham lives patiently looking for this promise, this coming city. And in between, he's learning to trust in the power of God to do what God says he will do. And now we see how persuaded all the saints were. All of these, Jacob and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and the rest of these we're going to see, that they all were persuaded and had this kind of persuaded faith. And that's why it says in verses 13 and 14, they were seeking this country. Patiently living in this world, trusting God to accomplish his purposes in a powerful way so that they might see that city, that country that was coming. Now, can I just underscore two words in there because they're new words that weren't used earlier in the text of Hebrews 11? It's the word strangers and exiles. When he says here they are strangers here, it's a word that could be translated refugee. Now, we hear a lot about refugees, right, on the news, and we hear all these horror stories of people who are fleeing. When I was in Uganda, Africa, the pastors from South Sudan had just fled, and they were living in a refugee city. So this is the word that he uses here when he talks about a stranger. And what he is saying is this: they were living their lives in this world every day that they got up. Though they had their feet on the earth in which they were in, they were not really ever at home. They were like a refugee. I love the way one second-century letter writing about the Christians of that day describes them. It says, to them, these Christians, every foreign country is theirs, yet every country is foreign. That's the picture here. They were strangers. And not only strangers, they are exiles. It's a word here for someone not more than a slave. That's the word exile. They're living in a place that really isn't their home, and they're living as exiles, which means they were really living in a place to where they didn't belong. And you could look at it like this. They had to pay, while living in this world, annual taxes as foreigners living in the land. And they were always considered outsiders and exiles of the community. That's the picture. And that's how they loved to live. They lived that way because they were seeking something better, another country. And then in verses 15 and 16, it talks about their sight. It says if they had been thinking of that country, the ones they had come out of, the earth that they lived in, they would have returned. But what it says is they desired a better country, that is a heavenly one. And we've already again thought through what that coming eternal kingdom is like that Abraham is looking forward to, and we are to be looking forward to. Now, what I'd like to do, and let me just, if you're sitting there with anxiety going, he's got another point after this. We're not going to get to the last point. Don't worry about it, okay? I just made up my mind right now. We're not going there. Because I want to preach to you a little bit. And I want to preach to you about something I think that you and I need to be stretched on, and we need to be challenged on when it comes to the issue of what Abraham was living for and what all these saints were living for. Though I stated it last week, I just want to challenge you. I want to challenge you to think about something in a way maybe we fall short of thinking about, and it has to do with the concept of heaven. If we're not careful, the way we think of it, and even sometimes sing about it, might make us reflect that life after death and going there is the end of the story. If our view is limited to when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. Or then he'll call me someday to my home far away where his glory forever I'll share. You and I might be falling short of the real ultimate picture that Abraham was after and what he was living for. Now, please note, because I don't want you to email me this week, I love those two songs. I'll even throw in there, I'll Fly Away. I love those songs. I think they tell me some important things I want to know and I need to think about. But if you stop with the concept of heaven as there and only there, you live short of what Abraham lived for. And I'm going to assure you that if you live only in hopes of that and not what is to come after that, then you'll be a person who will live a life of escapism most of the time in this world, just hoping I can get out of this world and have nothing to do with this old stinking world ever again. And you would be falling short of living what Abraham lived for. So let's think about this. You know, I read this, you know who A.W. Tozer is, right? So you can take it up with him when you get to heaven if you don't like the statement I'm going to read. A.W. Tozer said, Christians don't tell lies, they just go to church and sing them. And he's talking about worship and what we are hoping for and what's coming and all that. And he has an idea here that we fall short, really, of the bigger picture of the glory that is to come. So let's lay this out and be real clear about this. One biblical perspective of heaven, which I like to refer to as God's home, it's where God dwells, heaven is his home, is what we would call the intermediate state. That's what theologians like to refer to it as. It's where the believer goes after his body physically dies, right? The Bible teaches that when a Christian dies physically, his body is going to perish. And you can take it to any funeral home you want, and they can preserve it as long as they want, but that thing is going to perish. That's what the Bible says. It could be blown up in war. It could be lost at sea. It could be any number of places. But when a Christian dies, though that body is left, he goes where, church? Where does a Christian go? Heaven. He didn't go to limbo. He didn't go to purgatory. He goes straight where? Into the presence of God himself. I love what D.L. Moody said. He was preaching on the same topic one time, and he told his congregation, someday you'll read in the papers that D.L. Moody of East Northfield is dead. Don't you believe a word of it? At that moment, I shall be more alive than I am now. So when a believer dies physically, he is very much alive spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. He is filled with joy. He's filled with delight as he worships the Lamb of God around the throne of God. That is obviously what he is doing, and that's what Paul meant in Philippians 1:21 when he said, to live right now is Christ, and to die is what? Gain. And in 2 Corinthians 5:8, Paul said to be absent from the body is to be at home or present with who? The Lord, right? So that is true, but let's get this clear in our minds. The reason theologians refer to this as the intermediate state is because it's not the end state. It's not the final. People who die and go to heaven, they don't have a body. They don't walk around with hands and fingers and eyes, and there's not trees, and there's not the sun, the moon, and all this. It is a spiritual realm where they go to be in God's kingdom and God's family and God's home, but it's intermediate. It is not the final, ultimate state. In fact, if you read through the book of Revelation as we studied it, isn't there portions in there where even those in heaven are saying, how long, oh Lord? There's got to be more. Look what's going on the earth. Look at what's happening. The saints are being killed. They're suffering. It's not all put back right. But the final and the important and the ultimate view of heaven is not the intermediate state. It's the eternal state for the believer. It's heaven on earth. It's what the Bible speaks a lot about. Isaiah 65:17. Behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come into mind. A new heavens and a new earth. Why would he say that? Because that's what ultimately they were longing for and looking for, and the prophets were telling them about it. What about Romans 8:19 through 23? Romans 8, verses 19 to 23. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. They're looking for that day when God's kids are put on real display. For the creation was subjected to futility. That's the inanimate creation, the world around us. It was subjected to futility, not willingly. They didn't do anything to deserve this. It was what Adam did. It's the sin that entered creation through Adam's fall. They were subjected not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we await eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our what? Bodies. You see, that's what they're living in hope of. Can you get the picture in your mind? The whole creation. And this is just to illustrate this. I don't think you're going to go out there and go, man, I hear that tree going, oh, God, it's awful. It's not the trees that you're going to hear. You're not going to hear stars making noises. It's the picture that they know it's not right. Sin entered the world. The curse has done that which has destroyed the original glory which God made in creation. And they're groaning and they're longing for, and we are groaning and we are longing for, not for flying away somewhere up yonder and hoping that we'll be up there forever, but that we'll be here, a new heavens, a new earth, and a body which is completely restored and put back where there's no sin in it. No remaining struggles, no remaining sickness, no remaining sorrow, no temptations, just heaven gained again on this earth with King Jesus ruling in the center. You say, well, do you believe there's like streets to go? Absolutely. You believe there's pearls on those gates? Absolutely. I'm good with that. You think there's angels singing around there? Absolutely. But it's not up yonder. He's gone to prepare a city, and he's bringing it back with him. That's the picture. And that's what Abraham was living for. That's what he was longing for. Man, we don't have time to do this, right? But Revelation 21 and 22 is not talking about an intermediate state. It's the eternal state. The final consummation. So what all these verses are reminding us is this. When a believer dies, he's separated from his body. It's an intermediate state in the presence of God with joy, with delight, with worship, with satisfaction. But there's more to the story. The story is that when Christ comes again in his second coming, he will consummate his kingdom and launch eternity as he brings in a new heaven and a new earth right here. And you'll be in it, I'll be in it as believers. The earth will be redeemed. All evil will be eradicated. The curse will be lifted from creations. There'll be no tornadoes ever again that we'll hear about on the news. There'll be no earthquakes, no hailstorms, no tsunamis, no nuclear waste dumps, and you'll never hear anything about Harvey wreaking havoc in Houston, Texas, or anywhere in the world. You won't remember that anymore. That kind of stuff will be gone from you. That's what Isaiah said. You'll remember the former no more. I was leaving home the other day, and I looked over in our little flower bed, and I saw these weeds, and I knew Pam was going to tell me I had to get them picked. And I looked at it, I said, one day you're gone. And it won't be because of me. We'll live forever and ever in this presence of Christ on this glorified and restored earth, the new earth. And this is literally heaven on earth. You see, it's not far away up yonder somewhere. It's heaven coming down. And those who have died and are with him will come with him. Those who remain will be in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, transformed, and we'll all be together in that eternal state of glory. And that, brothers and sisters, is what made Abraham patiently endure. That's what made him patiently endure. Now, he was looking forward to the city that had foundations. He was looking forward not to a home here. In fact, let me just give you a little contrast to go back and study sometime. Abraham never built a city for him to live in on this earth because he wasn't living for anything in this earth. He was living for the city that's coming, God's city. Who went and built a city that was kin to him? Who went and settled down in the land around them? His brother, his nephew Lot, right? I think I don't have to tell you that story. It didn't turn out well. Lot's life was anchored in this world. Abraham's was anchored in the one to come. Now, so here's what this does, and this is it. We're done. The strength here of this point here that I want you to realize is that his strength was in that he lived as a stranger. He lived looking for that kingdom. So he kept his sight on that, and he kept his focus there. And so what happens with him is that the life of faith altered his self-identity, as he thought of himself. It means he thought of himself as a pilgrim, as a stranger, as someone just passing through. And that's what faith does to us. It changes our identity in this world, how we think of us and how we live. Thinks about how we live here, thinks about where we're going. My whole identity is not wrapped up in here in this world. And can I just wrap up with this little phrase right here? At the end of verse 16, it says, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Why is he not ashamed to be called their God? I mean, that's a question that hit me as I was thinking about this early this morning. On what basis did God say this to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob? Well, on what basis will God say to you this morning, you know what, I'm not ashamed of you? Let me put it in a word that might shock you a little more, because this should shock you, right? Did God look at me and say, Kevin, you know what, I'm not ashamed of you, buddy. Here's the word I would say. You could also say that God could say, you know what, I'm actually really proud of you. I'm proud you're one of mine. Now, why would God say that? Why would God say that? Did God say that because Abraham gave a lot of money to a foundation? Nothing wrong with that, but that's not why he says that. Did he say this because Abraham's name appeared regularly in the local newspaper? Nope. Did he say, I am really proud of you, Abraham. I am not ashamed of you, man. I really like you because you're a pastor of a mega church or you are a person who goes to a mega church. He didn't say that. What he said here is, what I like about you and what makes me proud of you is because of what you desire. If you look at verse 16, the therefore there in the middle of it points back up to what he just said before it. What he said before that was they are seeking a city that is to come, whose builder and maker is God. They're looking for something that's better. That's what they desire. That's what they long for. And he says, because you long for that, this is not your life. This is not your world. You long for that. I can tell you I am proud of you. I can tell you that I'm not ashamed of you. I'm glad to be called your God Because that's what really most puts me on display when people say you don't live for your life in this world. You live for the one that is to come. So here's the question for us as we come to this table, right? Jesus said to the disciples when he instituted the table, he said, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you do proclaim the Lord's death, right? We're reminded that it's through the death of Christ that we are forgiven. We have access to God. We're his children. But the verse goes on to say, and as often as you do this until what? The Lord returns. So part of taking the bread and the cup is saying, you know what? I'm a person who's looking for his coming. I'm looking for his return. And when you take that bread and you take that cup, you should be assured, based on what God is saying to Abraham and all the people of faith, that he is not ashamed to say, you're my kid. I'm glad you're my child. I'm proud of the fact that you don't live for life in this world, that what you live for is that which is to come. It's your focus, it's your value, it's what you want more than anything. Well, you might get up every day and live in this world, work in this world, do the things in this world, but you know it is not your home. Your identity is totally different than the rest of the world around you. So take that bread, take that cup, and know that I'm not ashamed of you. Let's pray.